Okay, we're in Genesis chapter 23 this evening. Last week, just to recap from last week, in chapter 22, we saw the testing of Abraham's faith when God asked him to take his son, his only son Isaac, whom he loved, and to offer him as a burnt offering, and then God intervening at the last moment and providing the ram as the substitute, the replacement for Isaac there. So we come into chapter 23, and we have recorded in chapter 23 the death of Sarah. So I'm going to read through the whole chapter here of just 20 verses of Genesis chapter 23. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our sepulchres. None of us will withhold from you his sepulchre, or hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land, and he said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price let him give it to me in your presence as a possession for a burying place. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went in at the gate of his city, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the presence of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. And he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, But if you will, hear me. I will give the price of the field. Accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed with Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver, which he had named in the hearing of the Hittites 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave which was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, before all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as a possession for a burying place by the Hittites. So in chapter 23 here we have the record of the death of Sarah, along with Abraham's negotiations with the Hittites to secure a burial site for his wife. Sarah, we're told, was 127 years old when she died at Kiriath Arba. The name Kiriath Arba, the name of the city, means City of the Four, and it was an early name for Hebron. We learn this from Joshua chapter 14 and verse 15, where the two names are mentioned. Joshua chapter 14 verse 15 says, Now the name of Hebron, this is in connection with Caleb, who took possession of the city of Hebron after the Israelites had gone into the land. That was his inheritance. And verse 15 of Joshua 14 says, Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba. This Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim, and the land had rest from war. So Kiriath Arba was that earlier name for the city of Hebron, and it's quite an important place in Bible history. Sarah is the only woman in the Bible whose age at death is recorded, which is perhaps something significant of the importance of Sarah in the account. And by the time Sarah died, then Abraham had moved from Beersheba to Hebron. We saw last week in chapter 22, verse 19, that Abraham was in Beersheba, which was further to the south of Hebron. So now he's moved back to Hebron, where he had been earlier. We've seen Abraham moving around from place to place. So now he's back in Hebron, and it is here that Abraham mourned and wept for his wife, we're told here, and his tears indicate his grief and his deep sorrow over the death of his wife. We do not know how long they had been married, but the book of Genesis covers the last 62 years of their married life together. She was 65 years old when she and Abraham left their home in Haran. Back in chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, we know that she was 10 years younger than Abraham, and Abraham was 75 years old when they left, so she was 65. She was 90 years old when she gave birth to Isaac in chapter 17, verse 17. Now, she may have been overshadowed somewhat by Abraham's faith, but Sarah was herself a woman of great faith in her own right. And she's mentioned a few times in the New Testament. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 to 13, the writer makes note of her faith here. Hebrews 11, verse 11 says, "By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore." She's also mentioned by Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, and commended by Peter here as well. He speaks here of the holy women who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves and were submissive to their husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are now her children if you do right, and let nothing terrify you. So we see those commendations there of Sarah's faith and character in the New Testament as well. So in her own right, she was a woman of great faith. But as well as being a wife and a believer, Sarah was also mother to Isaac, and her death had an effect upon Isaac too, as we see in chapter 24, verse 67 of Genesis. This is when Rebekah arrives to marry Isaac. Verse 67 says, "Then Isaac brought her into the tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death." Although he's in mourning for his wife, Abraham still needed to make arrangements for Sarah's burial, much as the same sort of thing happens today when people suffer loss or a bereavement. They're in mourning, but there are still practical things that need to be dealt with, and the arrangement of a funeral or a burial is something that people have to do, even though they are in grief at that time, and Abraham had to do the same thing here. So he approached the Hittites. The Hittites are the people who are dwelling in Hebron at this time, to negotiate with them for a burial place for Sarah. These negotiations took place in the gate of the city, where this sort of business would be carried out. We've mentioned that the city was the place where people conducted their business affairs, and where the elders of the city met in order to settle various matters. And this is what's going on here. Verse 18, the people at the gate, those who went in at the gate of the city when Abraham takes possession are witnesses of this. And in verse 10 as well, reference there to those who were in at the gate, or who went in at the gate of the city, would be able to witness what was going on there. In verse 4, Abraham begins this negotiation by identifying himself as a stranger and sojourner among you, acknowledging that he is an outsider and he has no right really to buy any property from them. Abraham's approach is courteous. he was dependent upon their goodwill in selling him some land. And his request is quite simple. In verse 4, he says, "Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight." Although Abraham uses the word give here, he doesn't expect the property just to be given to him as a gift. He's asking them to sell him some property for his permanent ownership. So the New International Version uses his words as sell me some property. That's what he's asking, that they would sell him some property for a burial place. The reply that he's given is recorded in verses 5 and 6 by the Hittites. They acknowledged Abraham's position by addressing him as "my Lord" and referring to him as a mighty prince among us. Literally, that last phrase is a prince of God. They referred to him as being a prince of God among us. So they could see that Abraham was someone who was being blessed by God, and the acknowledgement of his position, his greatness. The Hittites indicate their willingness to do a deal with Abraham by saying to him, "Bury your dead in the choicest of our sepulchres. None of us will withhold from you his sepulchre or hinder you from burying your dead." So they're not going to stand in his way at this stage in the negotiations, though the Hittites do not indicate whether or not they're prepared to sell the property to Abraham as a permanent possession. So the negotiations then move on to the next stage, in which Abraham rises and he bows before the Hittites, showing his eagerness and showing his respect for them. And he now asks that if they are willing for him to bury his dead, as they just said, then they should entreat this man named Ephron, the son of Zoar, to give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. So Abraham has already identified the land or the place that he wants, this cave, as a burial place. So Abraham is asking the Hittites to act as intermediaries in his desire to obtain this particular cave from Ephron. Abraham offers to buy the property for the full price. He says, "For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as a possession for a burying place." Abraham does not speak to Ephron directly, even though Ephron is present, as we learn in verse 10. It was customary to carry out these sorts of transactions through a third party or through an intermediary, much in the same way as we might do today. If you're buying a house, you involve a solicitor or a lawyer to act on your behalf. You don't deal directly with those who are selling, perhaps. Ephron then speaks to Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites and all who were going in at the city gate. Ephron offers to Abraham the field and the cave that is in it. Abraham had only asked for the cave, but Ephron is also willing to sell the field where the cave is located. And Ephron would be willing to complete the transaction in the presence, he says, of the sons of my people. So these are the witnesses, those who would witness this transaction. Abraham responded to this offer by bowing again and speaking in the hearing of the people of the land, the Hittites. He said that he would give the price of the field, and he urges Ephron to accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there. And now Ephron names the price of the property. No price has been mentioned up to this point, but Ephron now names the price that he's willing to sell this land for. He says, "My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." Ephron's words here suggest that he thought that this was a fair price and one that was not to be disputed. What's this? So 400 shekels, but what's this between us? Abraham immediately accepted Ephron's price without any further negotiation. He was willing to accept that. He didn't put in a lower offer or a lower bid of any kind. He simply was prepared to accept the asking price. And so he weighed out the 400 shekels of silver using the weights that were currently used by the merchants at that time. A shekel was a weight. We might think of a shekel as being a coin, but it is actually originally a weight. And this is why he weighs out these 400 shekels of silver. And so in this way, then the transaction was concluded in the presence of the Hittites at the gate to the city of Hebron. They would be the witnesses to this agreement. And this is the earliest account that we have of the purchase of a piece of land and what was involved in the buying of a land. There is another account of the purchase of a piece of land, a field, in the book of Jeremiah, in chapter 32, verses 8 to 12. This is when Jerusalem is surrounded by the Babylonians, and it's about to be attacked by the Babylonians and under siege. And Jeremiah is instructed to do something really that nobody in their right mind would do in those circumstances, which is to buy a piece of land. In Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 8, the word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah. He says in verse 8, "Then Hanamel, my cousin, came to me in the court of the guard in accordance with the word of the Lord, and said to me, buy my field which is at Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, for the right of possession and redemption is yours. Buy it for yourself." Then I knew that this was the word of the Lord. And I bought the field at Anathoth from Hanamel, my cousin, and weighed out the money to him, 17 shekels of silver. Notice the difference in price there, that Abraham paid 400 shekels of silver for his piece of land, and Jeremiah pays out 17 shekels of silver. I signed the deed, sealed it, got witnesses, and weighed the money on scales. Then I took the sealed deed of purchase containing the terms and conditions and the open copy, and I gave the deed of purchase to Barak the son of Neriah, son of Messiah, in the presence of Hanamel my cousin, in the presence of the witnesses who signed the deed of purchase, and in the presence of all the Jews who were sitting in the court of the guard. There's another interesting account there of a legal transaction being taking place there in Jeremiah as well. So Abraham, coming back to Genesis chapter 23, Abraham was now the owner of this piece of land, this field, and the cave, and the trees in the field as well are mentioned. So the rights to the property then remain in Abraham's family. So now Abraham was able to bury Sarah, his wife, in this cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the location of it is specified there very, very precisely. The field and the cave that Abraham had bought from Ephron was the only piece of land ever owned by Abraham, and it became is the first to be buried there. Abraham, when he dies, he will be buried there. Isaac will be buried there. Rebecca will be buried there. Leah and Jacob were buried there as well. The picture on the slide there shows the place today. It's known as the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and King Herod built the structure over it in his time, and then when it became a Muslim important place for the Muslims as well, those towers were built, added onto it there as well. So it's still an important place both for Muslims and for Jews and for Christians today, that they're in Hebron. So moving on into chapter 24, we continue the story here now with chapter 24 deals with the search for a wife for Isaac, We'll read chapter 24, verses 1 to 9, the continuation here. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but you will go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house, from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your descendants I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine, only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master, and swore to him concerning this matter. Now that Abraham was old and advanced in years, he was concerned about finding a wife for Isaac. Isaac is now about 40 years old. In chapter 25 and verse 20, we are told that Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife. So he's 40 years old. This would be one of Abraham's final responsibilities before his own death. If God's promise to Abraham, him having many descendants, is to be fulfilled, then Isaac will need a wife. The story of how a wife for Isaac is found is one which demonstrates trust in God and God's guidance of events. Verse 1 there notes that the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things, and he would bless Abraham in this matter also. Throughout his life, Abraham had enjoyed the blessings of God. In order to make the arrangements for the finding of a wife, then Abraham summoned his trusted servant. Verse 2 describes him as the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had. The servant is unnamed here, but it may have been the servant named Eliezer back in chapter 15, verse 2, who Abraham thought would become his heir as he remained childless at that point. Eliezer of Damascus is his name back in chapter 15. Whether that's still the same or not, we can't be sure, but that's a possibility. Abraham had his servant then swear by the Lord, by Yahweh, the God of heaven and earth, swear this oath that he would not take a wife for Isaac from amongst the Canaanites in the land where Abraham was dwelling. Instead, he was to go to Abraham's home country, to Abraham's own kindred, his own family, and take a wife for Isaac from there. In making this oath, Abraham asked his servant to put your hand under my thigh. This sounds a bit odd to us, but this was an ancient custom confirming, which would confirm a solemn oath. If someone took a solemn oath of this kind, that's something that would be done. But the servant wants to clarify his responsibilities, and so he asks what he is to do if the woman he finds for Isaac is not willing to leave her home and follow him back to Canaan. He asks, must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham is insistent that Isaac is not to be taken back to the land from which Abraham had come. God had taken Abraham from his father's house and from the land where he was born, and had promised to give the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants. So Isaac is not to leave the land, and Abraham is quite insistent upon that. Abraham, who had experienced so much of God's blessing and guidance in his life, here expresses his confidence that the Lord would send his angel ahead of the servant so that a wife will be found for Isaac from in verse 7, where he says that God will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. So Abraham is confident that God will provide a wife, a suitable wife for Isaac from his own family. However, should it happen that the woman is not willing to leave her home and travel to Canaan, then Abraham says that the servant would be free from the oath that he had sworn. So he would be released from that promise that he had made. But under no circumstances is Isaac to leave Canaan. So with the matters clarified, then the servant was now willing to swear this oath concerning this matter, and so he placed his hand under Abraham's thigh. Reading on here in verse 10-14, the story goes on. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all sorts of choice gifts from his master, and rose and went to Mesopotamia to the city of Nahor. And he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord of my master Abraham, grant me success today, I pray thee, and steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the maiden to whom I shall say, pray, let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac. By this I shall know that thou hast shown steadfast love to my master. So having been commissioned then for this task of finding a wife for Isaac, the servant now set out on this journey, and he took with him 10 of his master's camels, along with some gifts, which would be for the future bride and for her family. We learn later that he's also accompanied by some other servants, so he's not traveling alone. Verse 32 mentions the men who are with him, and again verse 54 and verse 59 mentions the presence of those other men who had travelled with him. And he travelled to Mesopotamia, which the New International Version translates as Aram Naharaim, which means Aram of the two rivers. And he goes to the city of Nahor. Nahor was the name of Abraham's brother. And this would be a journey of about 450 miles. You can see the location there on the map on the slide. This was the region where Abraham and his family had settled after they had left Ur. Back in chapter 11, verse 31, they moved from Ur into this region of Haran. Haran was the city there. And the servant then arrived at a well outside of the city at evening time, and he made the camels kneel down or lie down. The servant knew that the well would be a good place to meet the local people, especially the young women who had the task of fetching water and watering the animals. Getting the water from the well was the work that was done by the women. We see a couple of other references to this in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 11. Mention here of women coming out to draw water from the well. This is when Saul has his first meeting with Samuel. As they went up the hill to the city, they met young maidens coming out to draw water. And also in John chapter 4 and verse 7, with the Samaritan woman coming out to the well when Jesus is seated by the well. John chapter 4 verse 7. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." So this was the work that the women did, particularly the young women. It was their job to go and get the water from the well and to water the animals. So whilst he's by the well there, the servants pray to Yahweh, who he addresses here as the God of my master Abraham. And he asks that the Lord would grant him day in his mission. It was potentially a difficult task and a great responsibility upon him. And so he's in need of the Lord's guidance. So he asks that the Lord would show steadfast love or kindness to his master Abraham. And this love would be shown by God guiding the servant to find this wife for Isaac, so that the promise that God had made to Abraham could be fulfilled. He, in this prayer, he tells the Lord that he's standing by this spring of water as the women are coming out to draw the water, and he asks that God should identify the maiden or the young woman who would be Isaac's wife by the way that she responds to his request. He's not asking for some great miracle, but some simple sort of everyday activity. In verse 14, his prayer to the Lord is, "Let the maiden to whom I shall say, 'Pray, let down your jar that I may drink,' and who shall say, 'Drink, and I will water your camels,' let her be the one whom thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac. By this I shall know that thou hast shown steadfast love to my master." So the girl would not only offer the servant a drink, but she would also willingly water his camels. And he's got 10 camels, and camels drink a lot of water. So this would really be a remarkable offer that a young woman would make, and it would indicate the girl's character, her hospitality, her kindness, her generosity in her willingness to do this. So this would be the sign that would indicate to the servant that this is the one who potentially could become Isaac's wife. We will leave the story there for this week, and we shall see how it all ends next week as we continue on in chapter 24. But we'll draw this to a conclusion now. So if anyone has any thoughts or comments you'd like to make,